Without Marcus, we are ruined.
I'm Marcus, 49M, and I was married to Linda, 44F, for 7 years. She works in corporate consulting, makes decent money, very social and outgoing. I'm more of a behind-the-scenes guy. I handle finances, maintain our property, deal with all the boring administrative stuff that keeps life running smoothly. I've always been quiet by nature, but Linda took that as weakness. For years, she'd make these little comments about how I was too beige, or how I had no personality. She'd tell her friends I was boring, roll her eyes when I'd check our sprinkler system or organize receipts. I never said much about it because I thought that's just how marriages work. Someone has to be the responsible one. But 6 months ago, something shifted. She started getting nastier, calling me useless, saying I treated retirement like I was still trying to impress some boss. The comments became daily occurrences. She'd mock me for reading financial documents, laugh when I mentioned checking our insurance policies, act like I was some obsessive weirdo for wanting to understand our mortgage terms. Every morning I'd check the irrigation schedule and she'd make some comment about how I acted like it was nuclear launch codes. When I'd organize tools in the garage, she'd walk by and mutter about how I was pretending to be useful. If I mentioned needing to update our homeowner's insurance or check on our investment portfolios, she'd literally roll her eyes and say something like, "God, you're so desperate to feel important." The worst part was how she talked about me to other people. I'd overhear her on the phone with her sister. "Marcus used to be charming before he got so pathetic. Now he just exists, like furniture that pays bills." She'd laugh like it was the funniest thing in the world. I started realizing she saw me as some kind of butler who happened to share her bed. Someone whose only value was handling the tedious parts of adult life so she could focus on the fun stuff. And even then, she resented that I was good at it. She'd complain to her friends about how I was obsessed with keeping paper copies of everything, how I tracked expenses like some old miser, how I was paranoid about reading the fine print on contracts. What she called obsessive, I called thorough. What she called paranoid, I called responsible. But in her mind, my attention to detail was just another character flaw to mock. I remember one particularly brutal conversation I overheard when she was talking to her book club friends. They were at our kitchen table, wine flowing, and Linda was holding court. "Poor Marcus," she said with fake sympathy. "He spends all day organizing things that don't need organizing. Yesterday, I caught him alphabetizing our spice rack. I told him nobody's grading you anymore, honey. You can relax." All the women laughed, and Linda continued, "I think retirement broke his brain. He used to run construction projects, manage crews, solve real problems. Now he gets excited about caulking bathroom tiles. It's honestly kind of sad." More laughter. I stood in the hallway listening to my wife describe me like I was a mental patient she was heroically tolerating. That night, I started seriously considering what my exit strategy would look like. The disrespect wasn't just private anymore. She'd undermine me in public, too. At dinner parties, she'd interrupt me mid-sentence to correct things I'd said, roll her eyes when I'd contribute to conversations, or make jokes at my expense that left me sitting there like an idiot while everyone else laughed. I remember one particularly humiliating evening at her colleague's house. I was talking to another guest about interest rate trends, something I actually know quite a bit about, and Linda cut me off. "Oh God, don't get Marcus started on financial planning. He'll bore you to tears with spreadsheet talk." She turned to the group and added, "He literally reads SEC filings for fun. I keep telling him to get a hobby that doesn't involve calculators." Everyone chuckled politely, and I just sat there silenced. The conversation moved on without me. Later that night, when I tried to tell Linda how that made me feel, she said, "Jesus, Marcus, learn to take a joke. You're so sensitive." But it wasn't a joke. It was systematic humiliation disguised as humor. The final straw came last Tuesday when I went to Home Depot to grab caulk and replacement bulbs for our patio lights. She'd mentioned they were out the night before, so I figured I'd handle it like I always do. When I got back, she was in the living room with her wine, scrolling through real estate listings for condos in Costa Rica on her laptop. She said without looking up, "you treat retirement like it's still a job. Nobody's grading you anymore, Marcus. You can stop trying so hard." I didn't respond, just started putting the light bulbs away, trying to stay calm. But then she kept going. "Look at you, organizing light bulbs like they're evidence in a homicide case. It's honestly embarrassing how desperate you are to feel useful, like some sad old man playing house." She took a sip of her wine and smirked at me. Poor Marcus. Nothing to do but organize screws and pretend he's still relevant. I could feel something shifting inside me, but I kept my voice steady. The patio lights were out. You asked me to fix them. I didn't ask you to turn it into a military operation, she snapped. God, everything has to be such a production with you. Can't you just be normal for once? That's when she stood up, walked over to where I was standing in the kitchen, and looked me dead in the eye with this expression I'll never forget. Pure contempt mixed with boredom, like she was looking at something that had outlived its purpose. You know what? She said, her voice dropping to that dangerous quiet tone she used when she was about to say something particularly cruel. Why don't you just leave? Seriously, pack your sad little toolkit and drive off into the sunset. Maybe find some other woman who thinks organizing receipts is sexy. She paused, swirling her wine, enjoying the moment. Because honestly, Marcus, you wouldn't survive a week without me directing your pathetic little life. You're absolutely nothing without me. Nothing. Just a boring old man who peaked 20 years ago and doesn't have the sense to realize it. The way she said it wasn't angry or hurt. It was just dismissive, like she was stating an obvious fact. Like I was some pathetic creature she'd been charitably keeping around out of pity. I stood there for a moment, still holding a light bulb, and something inside me just went quiet. Not angry quiet. Peaceful quiet. Like a switch had been turned off. I didn't argue, didn't yell, didn't try to defend myself. I just reached into my pocket, pulled out my keys, house key, truck key, safe key, and placed them gently on the counter next to the caulk. She actually blinked, like she was surprised I wasn't going to stand there and take more misuse. Wait, seriously? She said, and for the first time in months, she looked uncertain. I looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, like I was seeing someone I used to know but couldn't quite remember why I'd cared about them. Then I turned and walked out. No suitcase, no dramatic speech, no "you'll regret this." Just left the caulk on the table and walked away. What Linda didn't know is that I'd been quietly preparing for this moment for months. See, I'm not just boring, I'm methodical. And when you're methodical, you see patterns. I could tell she was building up to something big, getting more contemptuous every day. The disrespect was escalating on a predictable trajectory, and I knew eventually she'd push too far. So 6 months ago, I started organizing. Not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I began documenting everything, creating legal frameworks, moving assets into protected structures. I wasn't planning to destroy her life. I was planning to protect myself from someone who clearly had no respect for what I brought to our marriage. I started by quietly consulting with attorneys about asset protection strategies. I researched trust structures, reviewed all our joint financial obligations, traced every guarantee and co-signature I'd made over the years. What I discovered was that I was way more financially entangled with Linda's extended network than even I realized. The first thing I learned was that our financial situation was much more complex than Linda understood. She thought we had a simple setup, joint checking account, paid-off house, some retirement savings. But the reality was that I'd been quietly managing an intricate web of financial relationships that kept her entire family ecosystem stable. I spent weeks creating detailed spreadsheets documenting every financial guarantee, every co-signature, every asset that was cross-collateralized with our joint holdings. I researched the legal mechanisms for unwinding these arrangements and consulted with 3 different attorneys about the cleanest way to extricate myself without creating unnecessary liability. Here's what Linda never bothered to learn about our finances. I wasn't just handling our household budget. I was the invisible foundation holding up her entire family's financial empire. Her father Richard's real estate business had been drowning after some catastrophic deals during the pandemic. 2 years ago, he came to me, hat in hand, practically begging for help. His company was weeks away from bankruptcy. Something about a Sarasota development that went sideways and left him massively overextended. Linda knew he was struggling, but not how bad it was. The man was literally crying in our kitchen, talking about how he was going to lose everything, how the family legacy was going to disappear. Linda was upstairs on a work call, completely oblivious to the fact that her father was having a breakdown at our breakfast table. So I quietly restructured his debt through an obscure commercial lender that specialized in asset-backed flexibility. I used our house as cross-collateral, created a complex guarantee structure that protected Richard's business while keeping my involvement invisible. The arrangement included trigger clauses that would activate if my guarantor status ever changed. But I buried those details in addendum paperwork that nobody ever read. Richard signed everything I put in front of him without asking questions. He was just grateful someone was throwing him a lifeline. Linda never asked about the details. She just noticed that her dad seemed less stressed at family dinners and assumed his business had recovered on its own. What Richard didn't realize was that I'd structured the deal so that his entire commercial portfolio was essentially dependent on my continued backing. If I ever withdrew my guarantee, his loans would be reclassified as high risk and subject to immediate review. The man's entire financial life was balanced on my signature, and he had no idea. I also co-signed the bridge loan that kept Linda's startup afloat last year. She brought me to that investor dinner thinking I was just arm candy, but when the conversation turned to risk mitigation and financial stability, I ended up impressing the hell out of their funding committee. They were particularly interested in my background in construction management and asset valuation. What started as small talk turned into a serious discussion about market resilience strategies. The lead investor, a guy named Jameson from Bayfield Capital, pulled me aside after dinner. "Your wife mentioned you've got experience in project financing," he said. "We're looking at this bridge loan for their expansion, but we need stronger backing than what they've presented. Would you be interested in discussing a guarantee arrangement?" 3 weeks later, Linda's boss, Graham, called and asked if I'd be willing to provide a stability guarantee for their expansion financing. They were trying to secure a bridge loan from Bayfield, and my financial profile would strengthen their application significantly. Linda was thrilled. She thought it made her look well-connected and professionally serious. I agreed because I wanted to support Linda's career, but I made sure to structure my involvement carefully. I required detailed documentation of their business plan, reviewed their cash flow projections, and insisted on protective clauses that would allow me to withdraw if circumstances changed. The paperwork was complex, but that's exactly how I wanted it. Again, Linda never asked how her company suddenly got approved for funding they'd been chasing for months. She just assumed it was because she'd given a great presentation, or because the investors recognized her talent. The possibility that her boring husband had quietly made it all possible never occurred to her. I wasn't doing any of this to be controlling or to create leverage over people. I was protecting our family, solving problems quietly, while Linda focused on her career and social life. But she never wanted to understand how our finances actually worked. She just enjoyed the benefits while mocking the man who made it all possible. The house itself was more complicated than Linda realized. She thought we'd paid it off last year, and technically we had paid off the original mortgage. But I'd immediately leveraged it again as part of Richard's debt restructuring. The property was now cross-collateral for his entire commercial portfolio, protected only by my personal guarantee. If that guarantee disappeared, the house would be reclassified as exposed collateral subject to immediate review. I'd also bundled our homeowner's insurance under a business rider connected to my old consulting firm. It was more cost-effective and provided better coverage. But if the business entity dissolved, the coverage would default back to Linda's name, assuming she even noticed the renewal paperwork in the mail. 6 months ago, when Linda's contempt started reaching new levels, I began creating exit strategies for all of these arrangements. I formed a shell LLC called Northern Trust Holdings with myself as the anonymous trustee. I started moving liquid assets into protected accounts that couldn't be touched in a divorce proceeding. I documented every single financial guarantee I'd made and researched the legal mechanisms for withdrawing them. I also rented a small house across town under the name of the trust. Nothing fancy, just a clean, quiet place where I could execute my plan when the time came. I furnished it simply, set up a secure internet connection, and created a workspace where I could manage the separation process without interruption. I created a detailed timeline for unwinding everything. I knew that when Linda finally pushed too far, I'd need to execute everything quickly and precisely. One misstep could leave me exposed to liability or give her leverage to fight back. The hardest part was maintaining normal behavior while I prepared. I had to keep handling our daily finances, attending family dinners, pretending everything was fine, while Linda's disrespect escalated daily. Every snide comment, every eye roll, every public humiliation just reinforced my conviction that I was doing the right thing. I tested all my access systems monthly. I verified that my asset transfers were properly documented. I made sure my attorneys had all the paperwork they needed. By the time Linda delivered her final ultimatum, I was ready. So when she finally crossed that line, when she called me nothing to my face and dared me to leave, I was ready. The night she delivered her ultimatum, I drove straight to the small rental house I'd quietly leased across town. It was nothing fancy, clean, quiet, and unremarkable. The kind of place Linda would call depressing. I found it peaceful. I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop and opened the folder labeled Separation Protocols. Everything was organized, documented, ready to execute. I'd rehearsed this sequence dozens of times in my head. First step, revoke guarantor status on Richard's commercial loans. I logged into the lender's portal using the secure credentials they'd provided when I originally signed the guarantee. The system interface was clean and professional, designed for high net worth individuals managing complex asset structures. I navigated to the modification section and found the guarantor withdrawal option. The system prompted me with a warning. Revoking guarantor status will initiate immediate reassessment of secured collateral on loan package. #7823RC. This action cannot be undone. Continue. I clicked. Yes. Another prompt appeared. This action will remove Marcus Chen from primary guarantor status and transfer liability responsibility to backup collateral instruments per agreement, Addendum 7B. All parties will be notified automatically. Confirm withdrawal? I confirmed. The system processed for 30 seconds, then displayed a confirmation screen. Richard's loans were no longer protected by my financial backing. The house was now exposed as primary collateral, and the lender would begin reassessment within 24 hours. Second step, withdraw backing from Linda's company bridge loan. This one was more complex because it involved third-party guarantees to Bayfield Capital. I accessed their secure portal using my investor credentials and navigated to the guarantee management section. The interface was more sophisticated than the commercial lender's system. I could see detailed analytics about the loan performance, risk assessments, and projected outcomes. Linda's company was actually doing better than I'd expected, which made me feel slightly bad about what I was about to do. But business is business, and personal is personal. I located the guarantee modification option and selected Withdraw Primary Backing. The system required two-factor authentication, which pinged a burner phone I'd set up months earlier specifically for this purpose. I entered the verification code and submitted the withdrawal request. The system generated an automatic notification to all parties. Primary guarantor Marcus Chen has withdrawn backing for bridge loan instrument #4471BC effective immediately. Loan subject to immediate risk reassessment per Section 12.3 of original agreement. Third step, transfer remaining assets to protected status. I'd already moved most of our liquid assets into the trust structure over the past few months, but there were still some joint accounts that needed to be addressed. I submitted formal revocation of Linda's access to all accounts where I was the primary holder. This was the part that felt most personal. These were accounts we'd opened together where we'd deposited paychecks and paid bills and saved for vacations. But sentiment doesn't protect you when someone views you with contempt. Fourth step, dissolve the business entity that provided our homeowners insurance. This would trigger an automatic cancellation of our coverage, leaving Linda responsible for securing new insurance on a property that was about to be reclassified as distressed collateral. Fifth step, submit the final revocation documents to the county registrar. These were the papers that would officially remove my name from various guarantees and transfer liability back to the original borrowers. Once these were filed, everything would be irreversible. The whole process took less than 2 hours. No dramatic music, no emotional breakdown, just quiet, methodical execution of a plan I'd hoped I'd never need to use. I closed the laptop, poured myself a glass of water, and sat in the silence. For the first time in months, I felt calm. No tension in my shoulders, no knot in my stomach. Just peace. The calls started the next evening. First, Richard, absolutely losing his mind because the bank had called him that afternoon. The commercial loans I'd guaranteed were suddenly in default review because my backing had been withdrawn. Without my guarantee, his entire portfolio was exposed as unsecured debt. The bank was demanding immediate asset verification and threatening to call in the loans. I could hear him through Linda's phone when he called her. He was screaming about betrayal, about how this was going to destroy his business, about how he'd already gotten 2 demand letters for asset exposure. Linda tried to calm him down, but I could hear the panic in her voice. "Dad, I don't understand," she kept saying. "What does Marcus have to do with your business loans? Why would his name be on anything?" Richard had to explain the whole arrangement, how he'd been desperate 2 years ago, how I'd quietly restructured his debt, how the house had been used as collateral. Linda's voice got smaller and smaller as she realized how much financial responsibility I'd been carrying without her knowledge. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Marcus never told me any of this." "He was protecting you," Richard said, his voice now hoarse from yelling. "He was protecting all of us, and you threw it away." Then Linda's phone rang. It was Graham, her boss, and he was furious. Bayfield Capital had pulled their bridge loan effective immediately. The automatic risk assessment had flagged my withdrawal as a material adverse change that violated their lending criteria. Without that funding, Linda's company was going to miss payroll within days. Graham was shouting loud enough for me to hear through the wall of my rental house. Linda was apparently pacing in her car outside, trying to find somewhere private to take the call. "You vouched for his stability!" Graham yelled. "You said there was no volatility in your personal situation. You brought him to that dinner specifically to impress Jameson, and now Bayfield is treating this like fraud by omission." Linda kept trying to explain that she didn't know about my involvement, that it was news to her too, but Graham wasn't hearing it. "I don't care what you knew or didn't know," he said. "I vouched for you personally. I put my reputation on the line, and now we're all screwed because you can't keep your marriage together." Linda kept trying to call me, but I'd already turned off the phone I'd used during our marriage. She had no way to reach me. By the second day, word was spreading through Linda's professional network. Someone had leaked the Bayfield situation, and suddenly Linda was being viewed as a risk factor. Colleagues who used to seek her advice were avoiding her calls. Her assistant started scheduling meetings without her. By the third day, the cascade was accelerating. Richard called Linda in tears, not angry anymore, just broken. The bank had reclassified 3 of his major properties as distressed assets. His credit lines were frozen, and he was facing personal bankruptcy. "Your husband was the keystone holding up the whole arch," he told her through his sobs. "I didn't understand how important he was until he pulled himself out, and you just kicked it out because you thought he was boring." Linda's company officially laid her off that afternoon. Graham sent a terse email about restructuring due to unforeseen risk factors. But Linda knew the truth. She'd become a liability because of her connection to me. Her coworkers stopped making eye contact. The HR meeting was perfunctory. They just wanted her gone before the company folded entirely. I heard later that Linda sat in that HR conference room crying, not because she was sad, but because she finally understood the scope of what had happened. The woman who'd called me nothing was discovering that I'd been everything, the invisible foundation that made her comfortable life possible. The foreclosure notice arrived on day 4. Linda was staying at Richard's house by then because she couldn't access our old property. The bank had changed all the access codes when they reclassified it as distressed collateral. She called my sister Karen, sobbing, begging for my phone number or address. Karen told me later that Linda looked like she'd aged 5 years in 4 days. Her hair was unwashed. She was wearing the same clothes she'd had on when I left, and she kept mumbling about how she didn't know and didn't understand what was happening. "She keeps saying it was just one argument," Karen told me over dinner. "She can't wrap her head around the fact that this was planned months in advance. She thinks you're having some kind of breakdown." But it wasn't a breakdown. It was the opposite. It was finally thinking clearly. On day 5, Linda hired a private investigator to find me. She was desperate, calling everyone we knew, driving around town looking for my truck. She even went to my old office building, but they told her my business line had been disconnected months ago. What she didn't know was that I was less than an hour away, staying in my friend Martin's cabin up in the mountains. Martin's a Vietnam vet who understands the value of strategic silence. When I called him 3 weeks earlier and asked if I could use his place for a while, he just asked if I still drank scotch and told me to come on up. I'd been having dinner with Martin, Karen, and her husband Brian at a quiet steakhouse in town every night since I left. No drama, no rehashing of grievances, just normal conversation with people who actually valued my company. My phone would buzz occasionally with calls from Linda or Richard or Graham, but I'd just turn it face down and continue eating. It felt incredible to sit at a table where nobody was rolling their eyes at me or making snide comments about my personality, where I could mention checking the cabin's generator or organizing Martin's tool shed without being mocked for being obsessive, where silence was comfortable instead of loaded with contempt. Martin had been through his own marriage difficulties decades ago, and he understood what I was going through on a level that didn't require explanation. "Sometimes," he said one evening as we sat on his porch watching the sunset, "the kindest thing you can do for someone is stop enabling their worst behavior." On day 6, Linda got the final piece of the puzzle. Someone at Bayfield, probably a sympathetic insider who'd worked with Linda before, leaked an internal memo from their risk assessment team. The document detailed how my unexpected withdrawal had created a catastrophic exposure event that violated their risk protocols. The memo was brutal in its clinical assessment. It specifically mentioned how Linda's failure to disclose the nature of our relationship had contributed to their decision to extend the original loan. They painted her as either incompetent for not understanding her own financial situation or deceptive for actively misrepresenting it. Either way, She was now flagged in their system as a potential source of reputational damage. Karen forwarded me the memo after Linda had apparently received it. The timing was perfect. She finally understood that this wasn't about one argument or one bad night. This was about a man who'd spent 7 years being treated like hired help, finally deciding to stop working for free. But Linda still didn't get the deeper lesson. She kept calling it a misunderstanding, kept talking about how we could work it out if I'd just come home and explain what was happening. She couldn't accept that there was nothing to work out. I'd simply decided to stop being her financial safety net while she treated me like garbage. On day 7, I got a call from Karen. Linda had apparently shown up at her house at 6 in the morning, still in pajamas, begging for my contact information. She'd been sleeping in her car because Richard was too stressed and embarrassed to deal with her presence in his house. "She's not okay, Marcus," Karen told me. "I mean, I understand why you did what you did, but she's really falling apart. Maybe you should at least take one call just to let her know you're alive." I considered it for about 30 seconds, then decided against it. Linda had had 7 years to treat me with basic respect. She'd chosen contempt instead. The fact that she was finally facing consequences for that choice didn't create any obligation on my part to rescue her from them. Today is day 8, and I'm sitting on Martin's porch watching the sunrise over the mountains. My phone is off, my assets are protected, and for the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe. No criticism, no eye-rolling, no contempt disguised as teasing. Just quiet. Linda got exactly what she asked for. She told me to leave, and I left. She said I was nothing without her, and now she gets to discover what her life looks like without my quiet support holding it together. I didn't destroy her life, I just stopped maintaining it. There's a difference. The woman who spent 7 years telling me I had no personality, who mocked me to her friends and treated me like an embarrassing burden, is now learning what nothing actually looks like. And me, I'm finally learning what peace feels like. Some people think quiet men are weak. We're not weak, we're patient. But patience has limits, and when we reach them, we don't explode in dramatic confrontations. We simply disappear. And when we do it methodically and completely, we take our value with us. Linda pushed a man who never made noise into complete silence. And silence, it turns out, is the only answer some people deserve. Update. It's been 2 weeks now, and the fallout continues. Richard's business officially filed for bankruptcy yesterday. Linda is apparently living in a studio apartment across town, working as a temp through an agency because her professional reputation is shot. I heard through Karen that she's been telling people I had a psychotic break and that she's the sufferer in all this. That's fine. Let her tell whatever story helps her sleep at night. I know the truth, and more importantly, I know I'm finally free.